How did humanity come to accept rectangular pieces of pulped trees as something to spend 8 to 10 hours a day working for? It's a pretty insane story. This change from hard currency like gold or silver is a really huge deal. Without it, we couldn't possibly have the massive industrial and post-industrial economies we know today. This change revolutionized how we do business, and forever altered how governments were financed. Learning about this massive sea change in how we, as a species, thought about money can help us reflect on our current historical shift from seeing paper as money to seeing bits, seeing digital ones and zeros as money. But before we can get to the exciting story of people trying to convince other people that paper was worth something, to understand why this is such a huge deal, we have to discuss a bit about how we thought about money before paper. If we go way back to the beginning of society, we find trade. Before early humans even really settled down, there's evidence that when we met, we exchanged things we had made or things we'd found. But as soon as humans started to cultivate the earth and form societies, we started to specialize, and that meant that we not only loved to trade, we had to. Now, often when we think of trade, we think of long-distance trade. We think of caravans loaded with exotic goods. But for our story, we have to talk about local trade. Because here's where we run into the problem of coincidence of wants. Or rather, we run into it everywhere, but if we fail to solve this problem at the local level, society breaks down, and we can't have the specialized trades we need to run anything beyond the smallest gathering of people. So, what is a coincidence of wants? It's the basis on which trade can exist. Let's say that I make shirts, and you grow food. Well, if you want a shirt and I want food, awesome, we can trade. But if I don't want your stupid food, or if you're all full up on shirts, well, we can't trade, can we? And that starts becoming a real problem for society if I want food but you don't want my shirts. Maybe I can find somebody with some third good that you do want, but that means that a lot of time is consumed by trading, and if I can't find some other good you want to trade for, well, there's gonna be trouble. And this problem runs even deeper than we sometimes think about when you consider the lack of refrigeration and transportation. Imagine I'm a fisherman and you're a farmer, and let's say that we want to trade. Well, there's this problem. Your harvest only comes in once a year. I can't trade you for a harvest you don't have yet, and all of those extra fish I caught today are going to be pretty rotten by the time your harvest comes in. And while this may seem like a very specific example, trade for food was probably the most prevalent trade of the ancient world. So we need to find a third good that we both want that we can trade for. But wouldn't it be convenient if there was some universal third good which everybody wanted and would trade for, so we didn't have to do some long chain of bartering every time we wanted something? Enter money. All money is a third good that doesn't spoil and that we all agree has value, thus becoming a unit of exchange, an intermediary good by which all other goods can be traded. And while we often think of coins made of precious metals for this purpose, the truth is, so long as it's durable enough and hard enough to procure, anything can serve as money. Tangent time! Turns out we have used a lot of weird stuff as money over our history. For example, cattle have often served as money. I mean, they're fairly durable, they last for years, they're practical, and they're reasonably scarce. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, alcohol often served as currency. You could literally drink your paycheck. Cigarettes have often become money of prisons and POW camps. Back in ancient China, money in the shape of tools and then knives became some of the first examples of precious metal money. And, my personal favorite, on the island of Yap, gigantic limestone donuts serve as money. They are so huge that once they are brought to the island, no one even moves them. They just remember who owns which ones. In fact, all of these stones had to be quarried off-island because there's no naturally occurring limestone on Yap. And once, when a crew was coming back from a quarrying expedition, a storm hit and sent their stone to the bottom of the ocean. But the crew survived and told everybody what had happened, and the islanders decided that, it still counted. So, to this day, somebody owns that giant piece of stone money at the bottom of the sea. And even though it's not really in use today, for hundreds of years that stone was used to buy and sell things, even though no one had ever seen it. Giving Yap, in some ways, one of the most forward-thinking monetary systems before the modern era. But if we want to talk about the king of them all, the form of money that has been used the longest and over the widest expanse of the globe, we have to talk about one thing. Nope, not gold, although in fairness that's what I would have guessed too. Nope, it's the cowrie shell. It's durable, impossible to counterfeit, and without modern harvesting techniques, it's not so easy to acquire that inflation will run rampant. Anyway, tangent over, back on target. We have lots of different possible types of pre-modern money, including the gold and silver coins that we so often think of when we think of money of the past. But all of these different types of money have one thing in common. They are what we call commodity money, because their value is in the commodity themselves. Even cowries were seen as rare and beautiful and could be used for jewelry and the like, and so were thought of as having intrinsic value, the same way we feel gold has an intrinsic value for its scarcity and its uses. Now that makes a lot of sense for a currency. It feels secure and reasonable. You can trust to the worth of that gold coin in your hand. I mean, after all, if you're used to trading one thing for another, why would you ever trade something valuable like a horse for something worthless like a pile of paper? But for gold or for cowries, well, that's another story. But when your economy grows, this system starts showing some of its limits. For one thing, commodity money is heavy. If you're doing massive deals, it gets really hard to transport, and it's risky to transport across lawless lands. Commodity money is also often subject to debasing, where somebody, usually the person who should be responsible for making sure the currency maintains its value, waters down the whiskey or takes a gold coin, melts it down, and reforges it with a bit less gold in it, and passes it off as worth the same amount. But more than anything, when you get to gigantic economies, the very scarcity that makes commodity money seem to have value becomes your enemy. Like, let's take gold and silver. What happens when your economy grows to the point where you just can't get enough of it? We actually saw the effects of this in our episode on the Opium Wars, where so much English silver was ending up in China in exchange for tea, it was actually causing inflation and hampering basic economic transactions at home. And this really comes into effect when we get to more modern government finance and the financing of war. What happens to a nation when it has to make a sudden drastic uptick in its spending but can't get enough specie to cover its cost, even from those who are willing to lend? As I am sure we will see in future Extra History episodes, it plays havoc with an economy, and even the ability to prosecute a war. And the reverse of this is true as well. Currencies based on scarcity are often subject to changes in the scarcity of the commodity on which they're based, which can be trouble when somebody finds a lot more of your currency commodity. When Spain started to import massive amounts of silver and gold from the Americas, all the precious metal-based currency in Europe started to suffer from inflation. After all those gold coins weren't worth nearly as much since somebody had just dumped a huge new pile of gold on European shores. And as a government or even a financial sector, when someone digging up a new pile of minerals means that you can't control your own fiscal policy, that's bad news. But those disadvantages are only easy to see if you're a head of state or working on the largest scale transactions. If you're just some average person in the streets, when some well-to-do says that they want to take your grain in exchange for this nice slip of... is that paper? Well, you would be forgiven for thinking that you smell a rat. Join us next time as we finally delve into the origins of paper money, and start to address this problem of people fearing to give up their outdated gold.
'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down to where we are to be.
While there's little truth to the idea that Marco Polo brought pasta to Italy from the East, there's another marvel that the book about his travels popularized. It was an idea, a radical one, which is perhaps best summarized by the very title of the chapter that discusses it. For in the Book of the Marvels of the World, or as we know it, The Travels of Marco Polo, there's a chapter titled, How the Great Khan Caused the Bark of Trees, Made into Something Like Paper, to Pass for Money Throughout His Realm. In ancient China, they invented a coinage system, where the coins had holes punched in them. So if you needed to measure out large denominations, you could just run a string through the center of the coins, and a particular length of string would hold 100 or 1,000 at once. But over time, the economy evolved, transactions got bigger, and merchants found themselves needing tens or hundreds of thousands of coins to complete transactions. And of course, a strand of 1,000 of these weighed about 10 pounds already, so it became a real pain in the neck to transport them. So the government started saying, how about we pay you pieces of paper that have the amount of coins we owe you written on them, and you can come pick up your coins at the capital whenever you want your money. And since the government bought a lot of things, these paper slips started being circulated everywhere. Soon, merchants realized that these slips of paper were always good, that they could be turned in at the capital for however much was written on them whenever they wanted. So heck, why even go to the trouble of turning them in? Why not just trade the slips of paper to other merchants for their goods? Thus, the merchants began using these promissory notes, or essentially government IOUs, as money. And then the government caught on and simply started printing up money. So by the time we got the Travels of Marco Polo, paper money was widespread, and this idea started to catch on even outside of China. Sometimes with little success, like when Gekatu, the corrupt Ikan of the Middle East, tried to introduce paper money after he'd already splurged the royal money, and had his economy collapse to a cow plague. He basically fell prey to the misconception that simply printing money was literally a way to print money. Needless to say, he was promptly strangled with a bowstring. But sometimes, in other places, the idea started to take stronger hold, especially Italy. The Italian city-states had already been playing with this idea a little. They were the economic dynamos of Europe, and the first truly great trading cities on the continent since the ancient world. They were also basically always at war. This made carrying around great heaping piles of cash a wee bit of a danger. So the merchants came up with a new system, influenced by the tales from China. At first, they began simply issuing promissory notes, basically IOUs. Merchants would get to a new town and stock up on supplies and trade goods, but rather than carrying the cash to pay for them across dangerous country, they would just give the seller an IOU, often backed by a very famous or wealthy merchant, promising to pay for the goods at a later date. But here's the trick. To keep anybody from having to haul all that money around, the merchant wouldn't ever actually end up paying the seller directly. Instead, he would just pay a bank in his hometown. Here's how it would work. The merchant selling the goods would take the promissory note he got for them to his local bank, which he had access to, unlike most of Europe, because the Crusades had accidentally created modern banking. Why let a little crusade get in the way of a good story about fiscal instruments? So, he would take the note down to the bank and cash it in for slightly less than its face value. Basically, the bank was buying the note from him for some amount less than it was worth. Then the bank, which would have branches in other cities, would send a rider with a stack of these notes out to whatever specific city those notes had originally come from. When the rider got to the city, he would hand them to the local branch of the bank, and then the local branch would go collect from the merchant who had bought the goods. So the merchant could pay for goods in a far-off location by paying his local bank after the fact. A pretty huge step forward for commerce. But what if the bank didn't have a branch in the merchant's hometown? Well, then the bank would just sell the promissory note to another bank that did have one there. So these promissory notes sort of started to take on a value of their own. People started trading these notes, and soon the banks got in on the action and just let you take out notes from the bank itself if you had the deposits to cover it. But this didn't reach its full form for quite some time. Fast forward about 300 years and move halfway across the continent to the little island hanging off of Italy's side. The year is 1640. The never popular Charles I's monarchy is deeply in debt. He had gotten into a tiff with the parliament and basically disbanded it for over a decade. But according to English law, parliament is the only group allowed to levy taxes, which you do need when you're a king and flat broke. But not Charles. No. He had all sorts of crazy schemes for bringing in money without calling on Parliament. So miffed he was at them. And in 1640, we have one fine example. He just seized all the money in the mint. And this is kind of a big deal because it wasn't his money in the mint. All the merchants and the goldsmiths of London deposited their hard currency at the mint, just as a place to store it. So the king just picked up all that cash and declared it to be another one of his ever-popular forced loans. And then he proceeded to also seize all of the East India Company's pepper, just to add a strange, if somewhat delectable twist to this tale. Needless to say, his head was promptly separated from his body, which leaves us in the aftermath with a bunch of merchants and goldsmiths. The merchants and goldsmiths got together, and the goldsmiths basically said, "Look, we have these giant vaults for storing all of our gold. If you want to pay us a small amount, you can rent a corner of the vault to put all of your money in." This rapidly evolved to the goldsmiths paying people small amounts of interest to leave their money with them in exchange for the right to lend it out. This basically made them into banks. And in their capacity as banks, when people would deposit their money, the goldsmiths would basically give the depositor a receipt, which they could turn back in to claim their money. But soon, these goldsmiths made a pivotal switch. They changed from making out receipts, which could only be redeemed by the person who originally made the deposit, to also offering receipts that could be redeemed by whomever held them. This allowed people to start using their receipts as currency. Rather than pay for something with a pile of coins, why not just put that pile of coins in the bank and pay for stuff with these far more convenient receipts? Of course, as soon as they started doing this, people began to ask for multiple receipts in small, regular denominations. So you'd go to the bank, you'd drop off 20 quid, and ask the nice fellow at the register to give you 20 receipts for £1 apiece, so that you could go out and buy some vegetables or something with them. As soon as you do that, you basically have the banknote, the fundamental form of paper money. and the goldsmiths were clever folk. They started to notice the funny thing about banknotes. These banknotes were starting to get passed around from hand to hand without often getting handed back in at the bank, which meant that the bankers could keep playing around with the money those notes were supposed to represent even as they circulated through the markets. After all, so long as everybody doesn't try to turn in their banknotes at once, the bank can lend more money than it actually has in its vaults. While one banknote is circulating its way from hand to hand, the bank can use the coins that note represents to cover somebody else turning their banknote in. And thus, fractional reserve banking was born, instantly expanding the money supply of England, but not without introducing some dangers. Join us next time as we move from these Wild West beginnings to the even wilder West personas that attempted to make paper money official.
'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down to where we are to be.
In the last episode, we got to the ad hoc, unofficial beginnings of paper money. This week, we look at some of the rogues gallery that really created the intellectual argument for adopting paper money in some more official way. When we last left off in England in 1640, the first unofficial banknotes were starting to circulate. But in the early 1660s in Stockholm, the first semi-official banknotes, the first banknotes from what we might think of as a central bank, the first banknotes that really started to replace a hard currency, began to appear. But with those banknotes come the problem of unregulated fractional reserve banking. Remember how we mentioned that the goldsmiths of London realized that using banknotes they could actually lend out more money than they had gold or silver to cover? Well, in Stockholm, they really went to town. Soon, there were so many banknotes out there that people couldn't help but notice. And as soon as people noticed, everybody rushed to the bank to get their banknotes turned back into coins, which, of course, they couldn't do. And there goes the Swedish economy. So clearly there were still some kinks to work out with these newfangled banknotes. Now let's hop back to England, one civil war and half a dozen other wars after Charles I so politely jump-started this whole banking thing with that forced loan of his. The year is 1695. The English have just gotten themselves kicked around in the Channel by the French, and if we know anything about history, we know that that will never do. So the English establish a central bank, the Bank of England, to raise money and to help the government pay to refit the navy. As part of this, they issued banknotes. But the idea of banknotes and their role in the economy had been a topic of debate in England for a few years, which leads us to the first of our roguish economic theorists, and yes, this is his real name, Nicholas, if Jesus Christ had not died for thee, thou hadst been damned, Barebone, who, for obvious reasons, went by the name Nicholas Barbon. Nicholas Barbon's father was, praise God, Barebone. Yes, really, who will surely make an appearance in episodes covering the English Civil War. Nick Barbon started his career as a doctor, getting his degree from the University of Utrecht and joining the Royal College of Physicians. But this trade had too much saving people and too little amassing vast quantities of wealth, so Nicholas turned instead to real estate and construction. Luckily, he hit a break when, in 1666, the Great Fire of London swept through and incinerated about 13,000 homes and left about a sixth of the city homeless. Huzzah! This, of course, was seen as a great opportunity by Barbon, who would rebuild most of London and even, very illegally, reshape it. If you've ever been to the western parts of the Strand or Bloomsbury, those areas basically exist because Barbon didn't listen to any of the restrictions that said that you couldn't build between London and Westminster. After all, as he saw it, that's where the open land was, where easier to build. I mean, yeah, it's open because it's illegal to build there, but what are they gonna do, tear down the houses he just built? They're already built, deal with it. And from there, the sky was the limit. Barbon first got into the reputable business of selling fire insurance in a town that had just burnt down. After that, he realized that he could invent the mortgage. I mean, I can't say that he was absolutely the first person to really invent the modern mortgage, but he certainly was the first major player to do so in England. He created the National Land Bank and began to issue loans secured by people's homes or property. He followed that up with a few stints in Parliament, largely to avoid prosecution. Then he retired to write some books. And it's really the books that we're interested in, and the thoughts he put in them. Because while I have been joking about his wild and rapacious greed, he was highly intelligent, and it's kinda hard to write him off as evil. All of these things he did actually ended up having positive effects, and his writing sort of shows that he knew that. Insuring people against fire provided him with a guaranteed profit, but also created a great deal more stability for the English economy. Fires were still a major issue, but no longer would they be a massive economic displacement. Instead, everybody would put some money into the pot to bail out whoever lost their home or trade to a fire, and he would skim a little from the top. Great for the economy. And mortgages? While we might today think of them as the bank's way of keeping us down, so much of England's wealth was locked up in real estate that it was a huge drag to the national economy. When people bought a house, that money just stayed locked up in that house. It didn't circulate through the economy, it didn't help to finance businesses, it just sat there until somebody generations later decided to sell it. But with the idea of the mortgage, the single biggest asset that most people owned was now freed up to help drive the economy. Instead of the seller simply getting a pile of cash and the buyer getting an unspendable house, the mortgage freed up that value. You could now spend your house and live in it too, meaning that that money could circulate through the economy again and again. And Barbin was also, of course, one of the first people to decouple morality and spending. Which totally sounds evil, I admit, but up until this point, a lot of the writing on money was written by the church, basically arguing that everybody lived the simplest life possible. And that's probably good advice in a lot of ways, but it doesn't make for a dynamic economy. Barbin argued for fashion and innovation, because they get people to buy new goods before they've fully consumed the previous goods, thereby creating demand. And while we're not to Adam Smith yet, the basic concept that demand creates supply and grows the economy is there in Barbin's work. But for us, his most important work is probably his arguments against mercantilism. Mercantilism was the driving political and economic theory in most of Europe in Barbin's day. Basically, it sort of saw nations as being in a state of perpetual economic war. The goal for any nation was to get as much literal gold and silver as it could for itself, and try not to give any to anybody else. In a broader sense, the object was to have your state be self-sustaining, importing as little as possible while exporting as much as you could. Colonies existed to feed the mother country, and weren't allowed to trade with any country other than their colonial power. And when imports had to be made, the goal was to only import raw materials, so that they could be turned into more valuable finished goods in your country. And while today we see a lot of reasons why every country trying to produce every type of good is a terrible idea, in some ways mercantilism makes a lot more sense when you think of economies based on commodity money like gold or silver. After all, if your entire economy is based on gold and silver, then your economy can literally only be as big as the amount of gold and silver you have. While many were starting to see this dilemma, Barbin cut to the heart of it. He basically said that even gold and silver don't have innate value. They are just worth whatever the market values them at. So instead of stockpiling more gold and silver to grow your economy, why don't you just get rid of gold and silver entirely and move to paper money? But these ideas of Barbin's are only the beginning of the intellectual groundwork that will see a world accept slips of paper in exchange for a loaf of bread, a cell phone, or a house. Join us next time and we will witness somebody else try to put their own theories on paper money into practice, on the grandest scale.
'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down to where we are to be.
Last we left off, paper money doctrine was just starting to be established, with people like Nicholas Barbin beginning to explore the radical idea that gold and silver didn't have any inherent value, only the value we gave them. Which leads inevitably to the argument that, in using gold and silver, we tied ourselves to a system that has all the disadvantages of a commodity currency without really securing for ourselves anything more tangible than what we'd get with paper bills. Today, we get to watch what happens the first time someone really tries to put paper money doctrine into practice. John Law, the son of wealthy Scottish goldsmiths turned bankers. Until his 17th year, he followed the family trade, but when his father died, he decided that banking was too honest of an employment for him and moved to the seedier side of London. There, he rapidly found that women and cards were far more to his liking than ledgers and receipts. He lived it up as the rake and rogue of lower London. But between the fast women, the high fashion, and the low cards, he more than once ended up having to run home and ask Mom for a loan just to get by. But it all came to a head one foggy evening in Bloomsbury Square. Law had a rival for one of his lady loves. A drunken quarrel turned into a duel. Blades were drawn. A step, a thrust, One man fell, red between the pavers. Before he could flee, Law was apprehended. He was hauled before the famous hanging judge, Salathiel Lovell, and sentenced to death. As he awaited the gallows, though, his friends and benefactors got his sentence commuted to manslaughter, and he was slapped with a fine and released. But the family of his rival was pulling strings too, and they appealed the decision. This time, Law knew to flee. He hightailed it to the Dutch Republic, enjoying the coffee houses, the gambling, and perhaps most of all, the stock market of Amsterdam. While he had always been of an intellectual bent, it's here he started to really refine his ideas, both about gambling and finance. Watching this small republic with none of the natural resources of the other great countries of Europe dominate the world's economic landscape galvanized his thoughts. He reasoned that if he could just understand what had created such an economic revolution there, he could export it to nations with more natural advantages. So he spent half a decade considering the problem, and all this reasoning led him to one conclusion. It was the supply of money and the availability of credit that made the Dutch Republic such a powerhouse. And where did he see the bottleneck in the availability of money and thus the availability of credit? The supply of gold and silver. If you're only going to lend out gold and silver, you have to have the gold and silver to lend, and that puts a ceiling on the size of your economy, which, while not absolute, is a lot more rigid than paper. And so he began to formulate his treatise, Money and Trade Considered, with a proposal for supplying the nation with money, with the aim of getting his native Scotland to create a national bank. Unfortunately, Scotland was destitute from risky Central American ventures and a failed harvest. The Scots were in no mood to take a risk on some theory. To cap the whole thing off, the Act of Union in 1707 not only crushed any chance Law had of convincing the Scottish Parliament of his plan, but also made him an outlaw in Scotland as well as England. So once more, our ironically named hero fled back to the continent. For the next 10 years, he moved between France and the Dutch Republic, speculating, gambling, and socializing. But Law was always one to learn from his mistakes. He no longer gambled simply as a gamble. Now it was a system. He put into practice the many ideas that translated from the financial world. He deconstructed the games he played, and worked out great tables of outcomes. He was renowned for being able to calculate precise odds on the fly and hold them all in his head. And soon it paid off. This time, instead of gambling his way to the poorhouse, he became one of the richest men in Europe, amassing what today would probably be hundreds of millions of dollars just from cards and market speculation. But his gambling did one other thing for him. It opened doors. He was affable, charming, and very well dressed. As he gambled across Europe, he worked his way up to playing at private, very high-stakes games in Paris, games which included some of the most powerful men of the land. And in these smoky rooms, he had far more opportunity to persuade them of his ideas than he'd had in Scotland. And the truth is, those men were primed to be persuaded. The wars of Louis XIV had left the French treasury empty, and the state burdened with insurmountable debt. The new regent and his council were looking for a way out, so when Law said that he had a plan, they listened. The plan was ambitious. He would form a central bank which would take over many of the economic functions of the state, right down to issuing money, which of course would take the form of his beloved banknotes. Most importantly though, his plan to bankroll it was genius. He allowed people to buy stock at the bank, paying only 1/6 of the stock's value in cash, and paying the rest by trading in their government bonds, the debts the government owed them. This scheme was genius, because the population of France knew that these government bonds were currently worthless, because the government was too broke to repay them. Yet, at the same time, much of the debt which the government had been crippled trying to service was the very debt the people of France held. So, in having everybody traded in, this debt magically disappeared, and people who previously thought that they had been ruined by purchasing worthless government bonds now had something of worth that they could sell or trade, stock in the new bank, because everybody was confident in the new bank. Genius. And as John's bank began to tick away, it all seemed to work. The paper currency was far more stable than the old silver currency. Nobody could clip its edges, and forgeries were, well, punishable by death. Now, with this first part of his economic system in hand, Law initiated the second part of his plan. He would form a trading company. With complete control of the economy, he established a monopoly on trade with the French territory of Louisiana, and gave that monopoly to a company he established called the Company of the West. The plan here was simple. Issue shares at 500 livres a share, taking 15% down payment and the rest in installments, and sell enough of these shares to pay off the remainder of the government's debt. Soon, buoyed by some of Law's own investing in the company, the stock price began to grow, and word got out. This opportunity in Louisiana was too good to miss. Law was made the Duke of Arkansas, and soon the stock jumped 100%, then 1,000%, then 3,000%. The problem was, there wasn't any wealth coming out of Louisiana. When this all started, there were a mere 800 Europeans living in the whole territory, and soon Law had to resort to the expedient of offering criminals a pardon if they would marry a prostitute and move to Louisiana. Meanwhile, the stock price had created even more demand for paper currency. As people borrowed and spent against their stock that was now worth 30 times what they had paid for it, inflation ran rampant. Now, if this all sounds kind of familiar for some reason, you're not wrong. Something very similar was happening right across the channel. Soon, Law's system, which he had thought incorruptible, was forced to bend. He had to recall some of the paper money, slash the value of the currency, and outlaw the sale or possession of large quantities of gold. But all this did was let people know just how bad a shape the Company of the West, and by extension the bank, was in. Soon it would not hold. Mobs formed, there were rushes on the bank, and Law found himself yet again in a carriage in the night, fleeing yet another country. But unlike his counterparts across the channel, Law wasn't operating out of greed, but rather out of a desire to prove the idea that he had burning within him. And while his bank and his trading company were a disaster from which France barely recovered, they were a failure in execution more than in concept. And so, despite such a catastrophic misfortune, there were those in Europe who heeded what was perhaps his most famous conjecture: that money is the value by which goods are exchanged, and not the value for which goods are exchanged. Join us next time as we take the final step toward modern money by getting off of the gold standard.
'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down to where we are to be.
Over the last few episodes, we've seen the intellectual underpinnings of paper money slowly come into place. But having nebulous ideas about why paper money might be good is one thing. Getting people to really believe and trust in it is another matter entirely. And so today, we're gonna tackle the development of the one thing that brought the whole system together. The thing we now use to prevent the very problem John Law ran himself into. Very rarely does humanity find ideas that are simply good. Most of the time, when a revolutionary new idea is introduced, we've got to stumble around in the dark for a bit, figuring out all the terrible ramifications and pitfalls that come with it before we can use it well. Paper money was no different, because when you start printing money, it comes with a lot of questions. Now, you might think that the first question would be, how much money should we print? But actually, before you can even figure out things like how to regulate how much money's being printed, you first have to ask, who's gonna print the money? Now today, this might seem like a bizarre question, as we're all used to there being some central authority in each country or currency block issuing one currency that everybody accepts at face value. But you have to remember that paper money didn't enter the world as part of some top-down system. Instead, it basically started with a bunch of bankers realizing that they could give people receipts for gold and silver instead of actually giving customers their gold and silver back. Which means that one by one, every bank basically started printing their own banknotes. And that is a mess to deal with. I mean, if you've ever had to go overseas and deal with exchanging money, you've gotten just a tiny fraction of an idea of what a hassle this would have been. But it gets worse. Imagine having a few hundred different banks issuing notes in your own country. Now imagine a world where our modern international currency exchange that makes it easy for banks to trade money doesn't exist. And then imagine having to deal with all of this just to shop in the next town over. This is basically the scenario you end up with. You deposit $10 worth of gold in your local village bank. They hand you back $10 worth of their shiny, bank-specific banknotes. Now you go off to the big city to spend your money, but when you bring out your money to spend it on something there, the big city merchant might simply not take it. Or, more likely, they'll pull out some big chart and say to you, well, let's see. Your bank is pretty far away, so if we, or more likely our bank, ever wanted to redeem these banknotes of yours, we'd have to travel all the way to your tiny podunk village. So, since that's going to be such an expensive hassle for us to do, we're only going to take your banknotes at 75% value. Now, of course, you would probably grumble a bit over this, but then the merchant would say, wait, hang on, I'm not done. It says here that your bank only has one branch. That's an issue. It means we're gonna have to redeem these notes as soon as possible because your tiny bank might go belly up at any time, which would render these banknotes you just gave me worthless. That additional risk and the inconvenience forces me to accept these bills at another 25% off face value. And so, your $10 that you deposited in your bank would only have $5 worth of purchasing power in a neighboring city, leaving you probably a bit less than jazzed about this whole paper money thing. So clearly, every country needed a unified currency that everyone could believe in. But this also had to evolve sort of organically, and it ended up happening in a similar way in most countries, because almost all of the problems we're gonna see with the move to paper money are solved in nearly every country with one great innovation: the central bank. But central banks didn't always solve all of the functions they do today, and in fact, most weren't established to solve any of them at all. Truth is, calling a central bank a singular big innovation would be a lie. They were really more like a patch server and a hotfix machine for paper money. So let's talk about the story of the Bank of England, because it was really the first institution that we would call a central bank, and many early central banks share a similar tale. The year is 1694. The government desperately needs a way to service its debts. The 17th and the 18th centuries would be times of unbelievably costly wars. For the first time, troops had to be deployed and supplied across the globe. Navies had to be maintained in every ocean. Powder and shells were expended on an unprecedented scale. This drove most major nations of Europe to the brink of financial collapse. To some, the answer was clear: establish a bank to service the national debt. So, after much debate, the Bank of England came to be. This is a powerful thing because having the government do all of its banking with your bank makes your bank pretty secure, and means that that bank's gonna need to have branches, or at least banks that they work closely with all over the place. And because of this security, people started to value Bank of England banknotes over most of the other ones out there. At times, people would even pay a premium for them, offering 1.1 or 1.2 pounds per £1 note, simply because they were reliable and universally accepted. But the Bank of England note really wouldn't become the official banknote of the country until 1844, the middle of the 19th century. With the Bank Charter Act of 1844, no new bank would be granted the right to print banknotes, and every time a bank was bought, it would have to remove its notes from circulation, meaning that eventually the Bank of England banknote would be the only paper money in the land. But even with this system, it wasn't until 1921, less than 100 years ago, that the last non-Bank of England bank in the country stopped printing their own banknotes. And in Scotland and Ireland, there are still to this day a few banks that retain their ancient right to print pound sterling notes. So this system of having one unified currency that we think of as being money, we take it for granted now, but it really isn't that old. In fact, in the United States, non-Federal Reserve banknotes were being issued as late as 1935. But even with this issue resolved, the lack of a centralized currency wasn't the only problem we were going to have to figure out with these new banknotes. There was also the problem of bank runs. With the invention of the banknote, modern fractional reserve banking really came into its own. Fractional reserve banking is where the bank lends out more than it can actually pay for with the money it has on hand, based on the idea that not everybody's going to try to collect at once. So, for example, let's say that you deposit $100 in gold at your bank, and the bank is required to keep a 10% fractional reserve. That means that when you deposited that $100 in gold, you enabled your bank to lend out an additional $1,000 in banknotes. This system is a great thing because it means that the money supply can expand far past the amount of gold or silver in an economy, and can meet the needs of a growing economic base, which is the very problem we were trying to solve with this whole paper money thing in the first place. But it does have one problem. What happens if everybody does try to get their money out of the bank at the same time? Well, if people believe that a bank won't be able to repay them, whether it's because they've issued too many banknotes or simply because they've made too many bad loans, those people start flocking to the bank to get their money out of there. This, of course, leaves the bank unable to pay anybody because they only keep a fraction of what they need to pay everyone on hand at any given time. So the bank collapses, and everybody loses. Anyone with money left in the bank is simply wiped out. And if this starts happening on a broad scale, it creates another problem. People stop depositing money in banks at all, and instead start hoarding it because they're afraid that the banks are going to go bust. Meanwhile, the banks are trying to hoard up as much real money, gold, silver, and central bank notes as they can, so that they can somehow pay all of the people rushing the bank to withdraw their accounts without going bust. This ultimately means that a lot of money is just sucked out of the economy. It just stops circulating, and we're back to our original problem of literally having too little money to make the economy run. This happened in England throughout the 19th century. But here again, the central bank patch was applied. By having a central bank serve as a lender of last resort, meaning a bank that could lend real capital to other banks, banks that were in good shape but didn't have the funds on hand to withstand a panic where everybody tried to withdraw their money at once, could survive, and the money supply for the nation wouldn't dry up. Over the last 100 years, we have found dozens of other little ways that the central bank can be used to hotfix problems resulting from our ability to print money, and we're certainly not done yet. There is incredible power in having one bank that basically can't fail unless the government does, whose function is much more about keeping an economy strong and stable than about making a profit. Because so long as the government is doing well, so is that central bank. And this has helped fuel the growth of a world no longer bound by the amount of gold and silver that's being passed around. But there's one more step to go before we get to the world we live in today, where currency is divorced from any real value except the value we give it. Where money works because we believe it works. And that step is abandoning the gold standard. So join us next time as we wrap up the history of paper money.
'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down to where we are to be.
In this series, we rarely get far into the 20th century because it's hard to have historical perspective on events that are that close to our own time. But today, we're gonna have to roar into the latter half of the 20th century to show you just how recently this idea came to be. This idea that seems so normal, that we all take for granted as if it were always the case. The idea that money is worth something because we all agree it is. Last time, we talked about the growth of central banks as a patch system to fix the numerous problems that occur when you introduce paper money as the basis for an economy. But for many people, one more step was required to really inspire confidence in this idea of taking milled tree bark in return for their labor, and that was the gold standard. The gold standard is basically the idea that your paper money is backed in gold, that at any time, you could take your paper bills somewhere and redeem them for a specified amount of gold. Now, I hear a lot of you say, why would you ever do that? Doesn't putting a currency on the gold standard just mean that we're back to the problem we were trying to solve in the first place? By tying money to gold, aren't we once again limiting the money supply? The short answer to that is yes, and we're gonna see just how that plays out. The longer answer is, sort of. This is a pretty complicated economic question, too complex to really get into here, but the concise version is that having paper money backed in gold, rather than using gold directly, allows far more options when you need to expand the money supply. And it has the advantage of letting you play fast and loose with the system when you need to. But still, why would you do this rather than have your currency float free? Well, that's where history comes in. You see, the gold standard solves two major problems. The first is inflation. As you can probably guess, it wasn't long after people started printing paper money that they figured that they could just print a lot of paper money. Way more paper money than they could ever redeem. Way more than even our fractional reserve banking system thinks is sane. As soon as people did that, you started to get inflation. And it could still happen even with a central currency controlled by the government, because when countries needed to, say, pay for an army, they would sometimes just print more bills to do it. More bills means that each bill is worth less, which was a problem, not only for those poor citizens whose life savings were now in paper bills, but also for other countries who'd been accepting those paper bills in exchange for their goods. Which brings us to the second major issue that the gold standard addresses: exchange rates. Right as paper money was becoming the standard in Europe, international trade was really starting to pick up. The Industrial Revolution was getting into full swing, and raw materials and finished goods had to be shipped and traded at a pace never before seen. Simultaneously, mercantilism, that isolationist monetary policy that we discussed in an earlier episode, is coming to an end, causing trade to rocket to even greater heights. But what happens when your ship full of cargo docks in some foreign port, and you try to hand the local merchant your funny green paper money to buy their goods, while they try to hand you their funny pink paper money to buy what you've got on your ship? Well, you both just sit there scratching your heads for a while. Back in the day, you would have just weighed whatever coins they were trying to give you and accept them for their weight in gold. But now they're handing you this piece of paper that you don't recognize and you have no idea how to value. I mean, can you even trade this specific piece of paper for anything when you get back home? But if both currencies are on the gold standard, problem solved. Just as an example, let's say that at any time, you could turn in $20 to get 1 ounce of gold. 1 ounce of gold is what your $20 are worth. Now, let's say you sail to England, where, for the sake of keeping things simple, the UK has set their gold standard so that an ounce of gold is worth 2 British pounds. This makes everything nice and simple. Since you're both operating on the gold standard, that means 1 British pound is the equivalent in value to 10 US dollars. Done and done, simple. So how does this all fall apart? Well, first we have to talk about how it all began. If you saw our episodes on the First Opium War, remember how we talked about the fact that all of Britain's silver was flowing into China to buy tea? Well, to solve all the problems I just talked about, the British were looking for some commodity to back the Bank of England notes with. But with all their silver gone, the British chose gold, and soon basically everybody followed suit. But this system had its own breaking points. Absolute adherence to the gold standard had to be suspended several times during the 1800s due to the massive expenses incurred by international war. But in England, as in most other countries, there was always a return to the gold standard in peacetime, with countries working to build their gold reserves back up and limiting the printing of further notes. Other minor shocks, like the California gold rush and other introductions of massive new sources of gold, would cause the system to lurch, but overall, use of the gold standard held up pretty well throughout the 19th century. Then came World War I, the seminal catastrophe, the shatterer of so many notions from our past. And like so many other things, the gold standard crumpled under the impossible needs of the war. Nation after nation abandoned gold to print more money to pay for the arms, munitions, and men that were being expended daily on the field. And as more and more money was printed and spent to feed the insatiable hunger of this war, trade became erratic. Trade from the United States grew far beyond what the gold reserves of Europe could bear. Inflation ran rampant, and after the war, many countries couldn't drag themselves back to the gold standard. Some nations, like Germany, who were spiraling into hyperinflation under the crushing debt of war reparations, tried to stabilize their currency by backing it in land rather than gold. Others, like England, appealed to people's patriotism and wrenched themselves back onto the gold standard by asking people not to redeem their money for gold just out of love of country. But even this fell apart as the Great Depression hit. Those few countries that had the wherewithal to stay on the gold standard, like the United States, were now hamstrung by how the inflexibility of gold prevented them from reacting to the crisis. And yet, many people and many nations thought of this as a temporary hiccup. Sure, the war and the depression had made a mess of things, but soon the good times would be back. Things would get sorted out, and everybody would get back on the gold standard. I mean, they had to, right? Without the gold standard, how is money worth anything? But those good times didn't have a chance to come back, because then came the big one, World War II. World War II was perhaps the most expensive war in history. Economically, it was totally unsustainable, with the US racking up enormous trade surpluses and every other country involved sinking into massive debt. But the world had learned from World War I, and as World War II wound down, many of the major powers met to work out the first real international monetary agreement, the famous Bretton Woods system. You see, following the First World War, Britain had owed the US a huge pile of money, which they couldn't pay back unless France paid them a huge pile of money it owed them. But much of the war had occurred on French soil, and the French couldn't afford to pay back the British unless they basically made the defeated Germans pay for everything. This, of course, had all been a disaster that caused huge financial and political instability. So this time around, things would be different. Reparations would be minimized. Repayment of reparations would be on gentler terms, and that whole problem of wildly unstable currency caused by countries like Germany no longer being able to adhere to the gold standard after World War I, this time the currency instability problem would be solved. And how would it be solved? Well, at this point in history, the US basically had everybody's gold, because everybody had bought a ton of stuff from the US for the two biggest wars in history. So the US actually was still on the gold standard. So the solution was simple. Peg everybody else's currency to the US dollar. That's right, the system essentially boiled down to the US dollar is redeemable in gold, and all other currencies are redeemable in US dollars. And so every country had to keep some dollars on hand to redeem their currency, which is how the US dollar became the reserve currency for basically the entire world. As other nations' economies recovered, the dollar became overvalued. This came to a head in 1965. Charles de Gaulle, who had always been a little bit miffy about America's position in the world, decided that he was going to act on that redeemability. So he sent the French Navy to cash in and pick up his bullion, literally bringing boatloads of gold back to France. Soon, other nations followed suit. By 1971, with the dollar still overvalued and the Cold War and wars like Korea and Vietnam draining US resources and sending US gold overseas, Richard Nixon finally took the step that many argued had to come, and took the US dollar off the gold standard. Just take that in for a moment. 1971. Less than 50 years ago. But here's where it gets good. When Nixon pulled the US off the gold standard, the shock was felt around the world, but it didn't stop many countries from still pegging their currency to the US dollar. So now you had currencies around the world redeemable for US dollars, and the US dollar pegged to nothing. Soon, many other countries decided just to let their currencies float, to let them be valued at what the market would bear. And so, just like that, almost by accident, after 6,000 years, we finally accepted money as an idea rather than a thing. Or, as John Law would say, we accepted money as the medium by which things are exchanged, not the value for which they are. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
And when we find ourselves in